Good evening and welcome to Regis Center for Art here on the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. I am Calvin Stalvig, an artist and teacher, as well as a second-year MFA graduate here in the Department of Art, where we believe that art has the power to transform our human understanding of the world. This evening, it is my honor to welcome and introduce Aarati Akkapeddi to Minnesota, who is here through our department's Visiting Artists and Critics program. We seek to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of contemporary art through dialogue, and we invite nationally and internationally recognized artists to present public lectures, create work in our state-of-the-art facilities, and be engaged with our students in seminars and individual critiques. Aarati Akkapeddi is a Telugu-American cross-multi-disciplinary artist, coder and educator based in Lenapehoking, which is the ancient homeland of the Lenape people, known also by its occupied name, New York City. Using family and archival photographs as source material, combining code-based and analog technologies such as photography, printmaking, and 3D printing, Aarati creates artwork about intergenerational and collective memory. I met Aarati in the summer of 2020 when they joined me and 6 other people to co-create an artist residency on Governor's Island. Governor's Island is a former US military base in the middle of the East River, and it is equidistant between Brooklyn and Manhattan. The Dutch called it Noten Eiland. The English called it Nutten Island, but before that it was called Pagank. For 3 months, Aarati worked in a space that had once been the kitchen of a high-ranking general's family home, and having set up an exposure unit in the pantry and using cyanotype solution on paper, arresting images surfaced from the water and were hung to dry against the paint-peeling walls. Last year, when the opportunity emerged to nominate an artist to visit Minnesota through our department's Artist and Critics program, I couldn't stop thinking about those images. But it was more than that. While simultaneously conjuring images through collaborations with generative adversarial networks, Aarati is deeply engaged in first-person interviews with their ancestors. Stories are remembered and retold in English and Telugu and situated in places such as America, England, Switzerland, and India, and span more than a century. Of the many things they have discovered is the sobering reality that much can be hidden in translation. Whether inaccuracies of what really happened are mistranslated purposefully, carelessly, or mistakenly is beyond the point. Though everyone listens to a playback of the same recorded interview, each person hears something different. Tone, grammar, syntax, and context can be readily used to distort meaning, to create truth. As we will see this evening, images, like apparitions, shift shape similarly. What really happened? How do you know? And how can you trust the record? It is my duty to inform you that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, contemporary, and future lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851, being the year of our establishment, and we acknowledge this place has a complex and a layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of many ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationship with it and each other. In other words, I'm speaking to you from the lectern of occupation, as a representative of an occupation. What does occupation mean? Student, teacher, artist. Words slip. Words are slippery, which means words are difficult to hold firmly or stand on because they are smooth, wet, or slimy, but also evasive and unpredictable, not to be relied on, and also elusive in meaning because they change according to one's point of view. Artie's work continually reminds us of how elusive words and images can be, how the language of the programmer's code is not neutral, but can be imbued with aesthetic desire, love, and a yearning to set the record straight. Their work is also a reminder of the incredible weight artists carry when they acknowledge that the record, the archive, and ancestors are animate bodies with their own agency and agenda. Artie's work has been supported by institutions such as ADA-X, the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU, ETOPIA Center for Art and Technology, Fotomuseum Winterthur, and the Lower East Side Printshop. They have taught creative coding in the Design and Technology Department at Parsons and as a designer developer for the Experimental Humanities Collaborative Network. Their solo exhibition, Akin, is currently on exhibition through February at the Photographers Gallery in London, United Kingdom. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest this evening, Aarati Akkapeddi.
A little short. This might take a second. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I was really moved by it. And thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really grateful to be here. My name is Aarati Akkapeddi. I'm an artist, coder, and educator. I'm based in Lenapehoking. I grew up in Rockland County, New York, also part of Lenape land. And my family is from India, specifically Chennai, Tamil Nadu, Hyderabad, Telangana, and Vijayawada and Machilapatnam in Andhra Pradesh. And my work deals a lot with collective memory and the fluidity of memory. In the two works that I'll talk through today, I am specifically thinking about family and intergenerational memory. So I'll walk through two recent projects of mine that work with machine learning and family photographs. And because in both of these works, I've used computational methods, I'll spend some time unpacking how they work in the hopes of shedding light on processes like machine learning, which I think are often intentionally or unintentionally shrouded in a lot of mystery. And so the first work I'll show is called "I Knew That If I Walked in Your Footsteps, It Would Become a Ritual." And so for this work, I trained a machine learning model on my own family photographs and used the images that this model produced to create both cyanotype prints and a video piece. And this is a photograph of the installation of the piece. And this is a still from the video piece. And these are some cyanotype prints that I created and also exhibited amongst family photographs, like real family photographs. And these are some close-ups of the cyanotypes. I should start with saying that I am privileged to be able to work with family photographs and to have family photographs. And I also have family photographs that go pretty far back. The woman on the left is my grandmother, who sadly passed in August, but at the grand age of 102. And she kept the photograph on the right under her bed. And that photograph, it must be from, I think, the 1940s. But yeah, it's all this is to say that I feel really grateful that I have access to these images. Taking photographs at that time and place was expensive, and it's kind of rare to have these images. And so I had actually started looking at family photographs and digitizing family photographs when I was a teenager, so many years ago. And I think my interest in them grew for a few reasons. I think one of the reasons, growing up in the United States, I feel like the images, especially the ones that I found in my grandmother's house, kind of gave me a view into my parents' and my grandparents' life that I didn't have growing up in the US. I think also an important part of this work, and also just in general, my appreciation for these images, is their ability to create a kind of jumping off point for conversations that can sometimes be difficult to have otherwise. And we'll see a little bit of what I mean by that when I talk through the interview portion of this work. And I think through having conversations around these images, I also started to realize that it wasn't so much about retracing exact footsteps or figuring out exactly what was going on in the photograph or around that time, but rather talking through those memories and understanding how they relate to the present. I believe that memory is always an approximation, and through approximation, it has a potential to become generative. I think memory mutates over time, over place, from person to person. And this idea of approximation and mutation is what drew me to work with machine learning in this project. To explain the connection there, I would like to take a step back and give more technical context to the type of machine learning that I used. So in machine learning, algorithms build a model that is able to make predictions based on patterns found in existing data. In this work, I'm using a specific type of machine learning called a GAN, a generative adversarial network, to generate images based on my archive of family photographs. So my archive of family photographs in this scenario was the data that the machine learning model was learning from. And the GAN, without complex knowledge like we have to distinguish faces or objects in the image, attempts to create its own fake pictures based on the data it's been shown. And in this case, the model's predictions are in the form of images that attempt to emulate the photos from my family archive. And this GIF diagram kind of breaks down the process a little bit. So the name generative adversarial network comes from this idea that there are two neural networks involved that are kind of adversaries, or working. I think they're working with each other, but I guess you could also think about them as working against each other. But one of them is the generator. And so it's kind of creating the fake images based on the original data. And the other one is the discriminator. And so it's kind of trying to determine which one is the original data and which one is a fake one. And they kind of go back and forth in iterations like this until slowly the images become more and more, quote unquote, realistic or closer to the original data. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper technically, and it's going to get a little abstract, but I think it's important to give this context. And so I wanted to zoom in a little bit into this part of the process in how the generator actually creates images. And so I'm going to use the help of Casey Reyes, who's an artist who wrote a book, Making Pictures with Generative Adversarial Networks. So I'm going to quote the book here. A GAN model generates pictures by inputting a list of 100 numbers between -1 and 1. For instance, if all 100 numbers are set to 0, a specific picture will be generated. If the first number is changed to 0.1, a similar but different picture will be generated. If all the numbers are set randomly to values between -1 and 1, a completely different picture will be generated. New pictures are generated by changing any of these numbers. Two similar but unique pictures will be generated with sets of values that are similar. The more different the values, the more different the generated pictures. And so for me, I think what's important to think, or what was interesting to me to think about was the fact that the GAN is understanding the image as a series of numbers. And it's, again, not really understanding the image the same way that we do. It has no sense of like who's in the image or that it's of a person or the subject matter. It's taking these numbers and expanding them with complicated math that I don't understand, but expanding them into RGB values. So 3 values, red, green, blue per pixel. So it's very much thinking of, or it's not thinking, but it's understanding the image as these pixel values. And I'm kind of hitting this home because I feel like with machine learning, there's a lot of kind of, I think, credit given to the model. But I think for me working with it, it was really about finding out where my creative control was. And as a sort of aside, but kind of interesting idea, just going back to thinking about this string of numbers, you can kind of navigate through the model by moving through those numbers in sequence. And so it's moving very slowly, but the tiny GIF in the corner, the bottom left corner is moving very slowly through iterations. So it's kind of like slowly changing. And so when you do that, you can create an animation actually. And that's the same technique I used on the right with this flip book of a different GAN, different project, but trained on Bharatanatyam, video frames from a Bharatanatyam dance. Yeah. Okay, but yeah, so getting back to this idea, I think often headlines and sometimes the way that we hype machine learning up, we could be asking the wrong question. Can machine learning be creative? Whereas for me working with machine learning, I was really thinking about, can I use machine learning in a way that serves the project that I'm thinking about or serves the concepts and topics that I'm interested in. In this case was thinking about memory as a fluid and thinking about memory as approximation. And in working with machine learning, I was also trying to figure out what parameters do I have control over. And so, I'm gonna skip this, sorry. And so for me, I think that the main area where I had control was what I was showing the model, what training data I was using. And so it was important to me to use only my family photographs to train this model. And when you work with, again, typically you need like tens and thousands of images. And so for me, I don't have tens and thousands of family photographs, but I did, as I mentioned, I am privileged to have family photographs and I have a pretty large family. So in the end, kind of over years of scanning images, not just for this project, but also just for myself, I ended up with around 1,000 images. And honestly, that was the bulk of the work. Like I spent maybe like 90% of this project scanning images and looking through them. And yeah, which was a pleasure to do, but I think also important to think about in terms of thinking about the labor that goes into data set creation. And I also used some techniques to kind of sort of fake the size of my data set, because 1,000 images is still quite small for a GAN. And so one of the techniques was that I sort of homogenized the data set by focusing only on family members' faces. And so I had cropped all the images around the face. So for example, the original image would become these two portraits of my great aunt and my grandmother. And backtrack a little bit. And so I think in the past year or so, there's been a lot of developments with GAN, and maybe some of you have heard of some of these applications and software like DALL-E and Runway ML, which are really great because they allow people to work with machine learning in a way that doesn't necessarily involve code. And so it can be like much more accessible. But I think it's also important to think about the data that goes into creating these. So DALL-E was trained on millions of images scraped from the internet. And so I think when working with machine learning, if that's something that you're interested in exploring, thinking about the software, if you use software you may have to give up the control in terms of what kind of curating what data you want to go into your model. And then these are some earlier iterations of the model before I had like 1,000 images. So just to show you how the quality and the quantity of the data that you have can affect the outcome. And these are some images of its current state. And so the top row are generated images and the bottom row are real family members. And so for me, I think it took a while to get it to this, I guess you could say fidelity, but for me, I wanted it to stay here. Like I wouldn't want it to get any more quote unquote realistic, because for me, I feel like I like the kind of paint, or I like that the images on the top don't necessarily look like photographs if you look at them up close. So I think as an artist working with machine learning, you do have control over the generated images and the kind of how close. Your goal may not always be to get it to be exactly like the original data. You may be interested in that space between. I also noticed in working with my own data set, it feels weird to call Family Archive a data set, but when working with my family photos, it was also really interesting to see bias in the model. And so one example is the generated images that the model produces, I think tend to look more like my mother's side of the family, which makes sense because my family archive does have a lot more images from my mom's side for various reasons, like access to a camera. And so I think that bias for me, I really thought that was interesting to keep in the model because it reflects my archive. My archive is biased in a way. And so, and this image is in the center is an actual photograph of my mother, and around are generated images that I think sort of have some of her features. And then in terms of like hitting home this idea that I very much had a hand in this process, these are kind of like, so once I had the model that Jen was able to produce its own family photographs, there was still another layer of curation and editing. So I chose which images to include in my final work. And so on the next slide are some examples of images that quote unquote didn't make the cut, just to show you. Because yeah, it again, it has no concept of who's in the image or the age. Like I feel like in the bottom right, it's kind of combining like an older person and a baby image, but yeah, so I think it's interesting to work with the machine learning model and really try to think about what parts I have control and what parts like where I can exert creative control, I guess. And so another really important part of the project was interviewing family members. And so I conducted interviews with close family members about the original photographs. And we kind of it was pretty open. There weren't really that many directed questions. And in the video piece that I'll show, the voices that you hear are the real voices of my family members. But you don't see their faces. I used the generated images I animated the generated images into kind of characters that speak with their voices. And I'll talk a little bit about how I did that in the next few slides. I used another model, not a GAN, but this model called a first order motion model for image animation, but it allows you to take a source image and a video. So in this case, I took one of the generated images produced by the GAN and the video footage of the interview to kind of map my family members' facial expressions and movements to the image. And And that was kind of an interesting process because, and this is like, this GIF is kind of showing how it works. So the video on the left is of me, and then on the right is a generated image mapped to those movements. And it was kind of interesting using that process because I feel like in a way it allowed family members to open up a little bit more, knowing that their faces weren't going to be directly shown. But then at the same time, it also allowed me to include facial expressions, which I feel like were really important in expressing the emotion behind what family members were talking about. And I didn't really think of the animations as representations of them. And in fact, a lot of the time, the generated image I chose for the to, I guess, represent them in a way didn't necessarily look like them or at all. Again, I was like more interested in, I wasn't interested in specifics. I was more interested in the fluidity of what they're talking about. And I also kind of edited the video and under loose themes. So you'll hear folks talking about in the first section, I believe it's moments where people are forgetting details in photographs. And then there are other section of the video is moments where people are relating past memories to their present and choices they made to how they feel in the current state. So I kind of tried to find those themes and pick them out. And now I'd like to show a little bit of the video, if that's okay.
Claro. Oh my God, why are you laughing? Oh, that's a weird picture of me. Looks like I was very tired, whatever. I don't even recall when it was. Yeah.
You know how old you were?
Must be around the same time.
Sundar, me, and looks like Shyam.
Who can you say there? In relation to you?
Shyam is my nephew.
And how old are you?
Oh, then it's me or? Oh, sure.
I think it's you, the tallest one.
Sundar probably was, I don't know, maybe I probably was 11, Sundar probably was 7.
And how old was Sean?
Shyam was 18 months. That's when my father passed away.
Who is you?
Income is.
Was his teeth are not like that? Yeah, right, we really get from this, you. That's not him.
Oh, that's Santosh.
Yeah. Oh. No, Santosh is not Santosh, yes,
That me too.
He's very familiar and he used to brought his wife, children away after marriage also, but I don't remember his name. Yeah, I'm not getting the name now. We'd pay the job of Madam and Murthy, yeah, his name is Murthy. He got married in Hyderabad, right, and 1989, October 10th. 1989, October 10th, yeah. So it was an arranged, oopsie, his birthday is October 17th. Hey, you remember, I'm surprised. Yeah, October 10th is his birthday, 7th is our wedding, yeah. This one, I don't know who they are. Maybe Tata's cousins or something, I don't know, I'm not sure. I have not seen them even. How you got the picture, I don't know.
From your house.
Or not, maybe his cousins or somebody, no, I never saw the picture. Yeah,
Let's see what happens.
no, we didn't have a piano in the house. It's not my house.
Yeah.
No, whatever that's not my house.
That's a radio.
Music system.
Yeah, we don't have those.
You don't say Africa?
No, they don't have.
No, no. You're seeing it.
Yeah, it could be singing us maybe. I don't know. I just don't like that saree though. Because when my father passed away, I wore that saree. I still have it. No, I just want to keep it.
You know, the birds used to build nest.
Really?
And then I used to tell my father, it's teaching me a lesson. The bird will find so many, we should see that. It will teach how to fly, from one branch to branch. By the time the nestling will be very much afraid, poop. And then 2 days afterwards, it will run up nearby the fire of the flame of the forest plant. That's all. No connection between mother and nestling. I used to tell my father that is teaching me a lesson because Sitaram Mama went again. Seenu Mama also want to come. So someday all the nestlings will go off. It will be an empty nest.
I'll stop it here for time. And then, because I want to show one other project. So the last project I'll show today is called Akin. It's a commission from the Photographers Gallery in London, and it's in collaboration with Stars.archive, an archive of Tamil studio photography in India, taken between the 1880s and the 1980s. And it's sort of a similar project in that it also deals with family photographs, but in this case, I was more interested in exploring the relationship between the personal archive and the institutional archive. And I was interested in finding patterns between images and similarities and speculating about the reasons behind some of those similarities around things like backdrop and pose and what events we choose to commemorate through images. And so for some context, my mother's side, my mother is from Chennai, and a lot of the images in this archive are also taken in Chennai in the same time period. And so that was kind of the connection and what led me to be interested in stars in the first place. And so in this project, I did use another machine learning model, but in this case, I didn't use a GAN and I didn't train the model myself. I used an image recognition model. And now I'm going to kind of go into the technical details. I hope that's okay. But I think this will kind of give context again. And so in this project, as I mentioned, I was interested in finding patterns and similarities. And so I use this model sort of as a shortcut, but as a way to think about, to sort through all these hundreds of images and find and arrange them by similarity. And so the model I used is called BGG16, and it's not a GAN, it's an image categorization model. So it looks at images and tries to label them with these different categories. And it's actually a really interesting model to look at because it's kind of problematic. The model is trained on images from ImageNet, which is one of the most influential visual data sets with more than 14 million images scraped from the internet. So from sites like Flickr, YouTube, these images were labeled by Amazon Mechanical Turk crowd workers, and they're organized into 21,000 categories. And the particular model that I use detects objects on the images and categorizes them using just 1,000 of those classification categories. And so the list towards the right of the slide with the white text is kind of a sample of those 1,000 categories. And the original 21,000 categories of ImageNet were created using WordNet. which is a lexical data set of English nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs grouped into sets expressing distinct concepts. And so you can imagine as it gets, it can get quite complicated, and the racial and gender bias of WordNet is something that's been publicly criticized and debated. I will find a way to share these slides, but in this particular slide and also at the end of the presentation, I have a link to a really interesting article and project kind of going into the details about WordNet and the bias there. And so thinking about all that and thinking about the limitations of using just 1,000 labels, the classification of the images I was working with were actually often incorrect. This is an example of the labels it came up with for the image on the left. And there's a few reasons for this. I think, out of the 1,000 labels, there are quite a few labels that don't really make sense for the archive I'm working with. For example, one of the categories is European fire salamander. Probably not going to find that in these images. And also, ImageNet has mostly born digital images. The images I'm looking at are analog. And so in an ideal world, I would have trained my own model, but it's not a GAN. It's producing its own it's not producing its own images, but rather recognizing objects and existing images. And I would need millions of images to be able to train on thousands of categories of words. But I was able to use some techniques that made this existing model work for me. And so going back to this idea of an image being represented by strings of numbers, this model also uses vector representation. So before the model assigns labels from the 1,000 categories to the image, it creates a unique series of numbers that represent the image. And so in theory, images that are similar will have less distance between those vectors, or less distance between those embeddings, which is another word for this string of numbers on the right. So for example, here, the numbers on the right are the representation of the image on the left. And the numbers on the bottom left are the image, or the representation of the image on the bottom right. And the difference between them is 0.333024, blah, 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 blah. Whereas if I find the difference between the embeddings for the first image and this image, it's a higher number. It's at 1.01 something something, as opposed to that 0.333. So using that, I was able to still kind of arrange the images based on similarity. And so I didn't really use the labeling, but I was able to kind of create a grid of images sorted by those number representations. And so once I did that, I was able to kind of go in and, with my own discretion, start to pull out areas or like clusters that I thought were important. So for example, you can see in the center, these are close crop portraits of people. And then on the left, it's like portraits of couples. And when I was thinking about what clusters I was interested in or what groupings I was interested in, I also tried to value the meaning over the number of images in the cluster. So there are some groups that have very few images, but I think they illustrate a cultural aspect that I wanted to give space to. So for example, here, these are all images of women standing in front of standing mirrors. And I thought that was a really interesting trend I saw, even though it was in fewer images, because it shows the elaborate stitching of flowers into the hair. And so using this technique, I created a bunch of photographic clusters clusters of photographs that I put into the shape of a column. And a column, or rangoli or mugu, there's different names for it, but it's a pattern traditionally drawn with rice flour by women on the entrance of buildings or the home. And the image on the top left is an example of that. And each group in the column is represented by a central image, which is a composite averaging of all the images within the cluster. And then in the very center of the entire pattern is a video piece, another video piece with oral interviews with family members reflecting on the experience, getting their photographs taken in the studios. But I also interviewed for this video a Stars Archive researcher and founder about specific techniques and characteristics of Tamil studio photography. So again, I was interested in kind of juxtaposing the personal and this like more institutional, I guess, or anthropological point of view. And I also, and these are some installation shots. And I also created with the composite images, I created risograph prints with gold ink on black paper of each of the clusters that's represented in the column. And I think I'll play some, and I also made a online version that I'll show at the end if there's time. But I want to play a little bit of the video just to give some context. Let's see.
When Tata was about to leave for Geneva, and this is taken in a Guhan studio in Adayar.
I don't even think they exist now. It was on a place in Chennai, which is called Madras, then called Adyar, A-D-Y-A-R. It's actually very cramped, very small. And then there was a bare minimum sort of a 1 foot by 8 by 11 inch kind of a mirror somewhere, and then combs and whatnot.
After all those bus journeys and everything, to kind of touch yourself back up and make sure you look presentable.
It was done by a very old, really wooden kind of a camera with bellows in the front kind of a stuff. It was very, very old fashioned. I remember, I mean, it's a big thing, and literally the guy would take a sort of a lens cover off for some amount of time and then snap it back. I remember a very old man there who would have a very fine point brush with India ink and stuff. Those are indelible. You can't erase those things off. And he would touch the pictures. And that old guy was really very good. And I used to marvel at it.
You know why all of them having grumpy face? They are all, we thought we just go out for breakfast. Then Tata said, let us finish off the photograph and then go. The children were hungry, so they are.
That's my pissed off look as a child. Although surprisingly, the others seem to be more pissed off than I.
The rest of us were just supposed to maintain serious looks, no smiling, you know. That was one of the rules back then, you know. So you're supposed to look regal.
And the one that your mom is sitting on is basically sort of a tilted bamboo thing. And on the bottom would be a bicycle tire. Actually, it's kind of tough to see.
Morda, we called it in Indian language. It's like a drum shape. She's sitting on that.
The gown that I'm wearing, the frock was stitched by my mother.
You see that frock I stitched by myself.
So back on the back is a bunch of pull down canvas like things with, so there's a very faded version of a column in the back behind my mom, a bookcase like thing that's semi faded. And I don't know who picked this particular backdrop. I suspect it's my mom. It shows what they thought, you know, just like a pretense to what we think is opulence, or whatever is the right phrase here. And so this thing, I just say, listen, these guys all come from lower middle class backgrounds. Like, oh, this is the way how the rich live, or something. I have no idea. But if I ask this question to my mom, she'll get a little bit upset. And it's a very tough conversation to have.
So as the pictures, the photos taken in the late 19th, early 20th century have these pillars and plastic flowers and painted backdrops of kind of neoclassical palatial housings. My guess is that that style endured. It shows opulence, it shows social status.
Now, this image, after my father came back,
This one may have been taken, I'm trying to remember, because I was getting ready to go to the US.
the style is totally different, and those are real curtains though, but there's no fake, what do you call them? That thing doesn't, it's not there. I think both my mom and my dad saw more of the world and said, fuck this, we don't need this kind of, just a plain backdrop is good enough. The notion of fake opulence changed. Yeah, that is my father. I would almost say before he left for the United States, my father's father is in the middle and my father's mother.
And the other thing is grandma got a stroke a few years into, what is that, I think late 60s, something like that, so.
Sorry, I'm gonna pause it here because I just realized the time. So I'll show the last part of the project, which is the website. There's a link if you want to check it out. But the website was important because it gave me space to be able to show, like delve into the actual layers of the composite and give space to give credit to the actual studios. In a lot of cases, the images didn't have, and now it's, of course, now that I'm in front of the podium, it's not gonna, but it'll load. But basically you can pull apart the composite images and then see if there's information about it, where the photo was taken, like what studio, what city. Most of the photos from the archive, from the STARS archive, don't have information about the subjects in the image. In some cases, I was able to kind of infer things based on like a sign in the background or the way people were dressed. But I think for every archive photo, there's no credits for the people in them. But if you see someone you know, you should reach out. So let me know and I can add a credit. But yeah, and then for my family photographs are also mixed in here. And in that case, I do have some more information about them. But yeah, and so I think that's all I wanted to show today. And I think I will be in the future taking a break from family related material because I think it's good to give space for that. But as I mentioned at the end of this, end of these slides, which I'll share, I put resources, so readings, more about machine learning, also links to other artists that work with machine learning. If you're interested, please feel free to check it out. And thank you so much for having me here. Sorry.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment or a question. And the last video was playing something that this was phenomenological, was looking at the backdrops, and then as you spoke earlier, stress the importance of understanding machine learning. The early analog machine of the camera created an algorithm for backdrops. So as I'm listening to the family talk about describing the backdrops used, but then your family rejecting that, and that connecting to the way you're working this project and finding these biases in places and wanting to enter the matrix, if you will, to bring that clarity. You could have kept playing it. But I just thought that was just profound. So I just really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Appreciate it.
A really simple technical question. What the photographs towards the end that were
Oh, yeah, they're risograph prints. Well, sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. Risograph prints and it's gold ink. So I printed, I guess, like the negative of the image on black paper. Risographs are like, I'm forgetting like when they're from or when they were popular, but it's almost like silkscreen where you, yeah, but you can, it's a machine that you can mimic. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe it's obvious, but I would be happy to hear more like your comment on this, because you're talking about the computer generating program as connect to memory. And I'm assuming human memory, but you also talk about like ecological memory, the earth memory, and so on. And I mean, it's personal. This all is very personal to you, and I'm wondering. I'm curious to know about your personal connection and between like your memory and what it seems to me that it's the lack of certain memory that maybe the photograph have and you don't have. And what's, I mean, I'm wondering if like you're thinking about like, is the computer running program like give some present to something that is you know, the human memory lack, or like, you know, like I'm wondering what you think about that. And you know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was thinking about the machine learning model is like almost in parallel with how I was remembering or not able to remember. I think when I first started gathering family photos, like before this project and just for myself, when I first started digitizing them, I was thinking that like the more I find, the more I'll understand about my family, but it kind of just, I think through this process of making this work and through the process of talking to family members, I realized that I'm never going to be able to understand fully. It's, and it kind of, the importance shifted to focus to like more about like emotional connections between me and my family members and like how their memories influence their present rather than like finding more about facts or details. And I think the machine learning model felt almost like a metaphor to me because it does have consistencies between the original images and the generated ones. Like I do see like people's features, and when I show it to family members, they're kind of trying to like dissect like, oh, that's that person's ears or but it's also different and it's like it's not right, it's not quite right. So I feel like that space between was something that I wanted to like lean into.
Like maybe a two-part question. One is more, I'm not married, and so I'm not married. Thank you for your thoughts. Really informative. I'm sharing a lot of the noise about what I've seen, what I've heard. I have a technical question and then I also have another question. So, one of my questions is like, what is your relationship with AI and learning, like how have you been studying this, when did it come to your life, how did you go about educating yourself with that sort of knowledge? And my other question is just something that I think about artists that work with a lot of families and interviews. And I mean, I haven't shared a lot of my work because of like my own ethical questions, like when you're trying to do a conjure work, right, you're trying to feel what is unseen, and especially like you're doing bloodline work, which I don't consider to be blood work, you know, in that way. I'm always thinking about like ethically, like how do you begin to produce like art with your people's images? And it's like I'm always thinking about how to protect my folks' images when I'm working with them in such a particular kind of way. And I know other artists love them really well to honor these same things. How did that ever factor into like you work back in, you are working with AI, how so, you need the images to be protected in the same way that your family's real images are, how do you go about that? How do you factor that in your, and we can have this conversation more later.
Thank you for that question. That's, I feel like, a really important one. I guess I'll answer the second question first. I think it was really nuanced, like trying to navigate consent, especially with the oral history interviews, because even though I explained the project and kind of obtained consent and context, it's still like I think from being close to the person I was interviewing, I knew there were parts of the interview, even though I got consent, that I know that they would later maybe not want in the video. And so I kind of had to use my judgment and like edit out parts. And I kind of tried to keep, because I wasn't even really interested in those specifics anyway, I kind of edited the video so that there's not, you get a feel for what someone's talking about, but not necessarily the details, if that makes sense. And so, and in terms of showing the images, I think in the first one, I did show real family photographs in the installation, but the ones that I showed in the installation are only of close immediate family members that I could ask permission from. And also in terms of protecting images, this machine learning model, I don't plan on sharing, sharing the model itself, or the images that I scanned, which kind of has posed, the archive of images has posed some interesting questions because I don't know, like I want them to be available to family members and accessible, but then I also am thinking kind of along what you were saying, like making sure that they are protected, and I don't want everyone to be able to access them. So navigating that's been tricky, and I'm actually not really sure what to do with them. They're kind of just like sitting on a drive, not accessible, but yeah, I think that's something I'm still trying to think through. And then in terms of machine learning, I come from a web development background, so I did have some coding knowledge, but I actually learned a lot from a resource that I have listed at the end called Machine Learning for Artists. But I kind of just went through like tutorials by myself and got a feel for how things worked very slowly over time. But yeah, I think hopefully if you're interested in it, there's some resources here like Machine Learning for Artists, or the book that I mentioned, which I have with me if you want to look at it. But I know we're running out of time, sorry.
Thank you so much. And I love, especially the fluidity between material and media. I was really wondering about when the voice came into your idea for the project. For me, that became such a synthesis of all of these dimensions and relations of part of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was feeling some type of way about working with my family's images and like thinking about these themes, but I felt like I wanted a way to include them more directly. And so the interviews felt like a really good way to give space to them to talk about what they wanted to talk about. And then like using that animation technique also, I think helped with comfort level of like not having to show your face, but, and I only interviewed close family members for the first project. And I think having that relationship with them also helped, but yeah, I think it was about like finding a way to include them more.
Thank you so much, Ray.
Thank you.